December 7, 1941, North Pacific skies. The morning air was razor cold, slicing through the open cockpits of Mitsubishi A6M0s as they roared toward Oahu. Inside the lead formation, pilots grinned behind their goggles, confident, precise, unstoppable. The Empire's finest aviators. Their orders were clear: strike fast, strike first, leave nothing standing. Far below them, on a quiet ridge outside Honolulu, two young U.S. soldiers watched a glowing line crawl across a radar screen. Flips, too many to count, moving straight toward the island. The equipment was new, experimental, barely trusted. Their warning call was dismissed as a training error. Minutes later, Pearl Harbor erupted in fire. For Japan, it was a moment of triumph. Proof that daring and skill could crush an enemy before he even knew danger was coming. For the Allies, it was a cruel lesson written in smoke, but soon invisible waves would fight back. And the same unseen power Japan mocked, radar, would begin to watch them before their eyes could even see. The age of the blind warrior was ending. In the decade leading up to World War II, Japan's military elite held an unshakable belief. Victory was born not from machines, but from spirit. Theirs was a doctrine rooted in Bushido, the samurai code that glorified courage, discipline, and sacrifice. To Japanese strategists, modern war was not about technology or radar screens. It was about the will to die beautifully for the emperor. Across the seas, however, another kind of revolution was already humming through laboratories and coastal stations. In Britain, engineers under Sir Robert Watson-Watt had been experimenting with radio detection and ranging, soon shortened to a single sharp word: radar. In America, scientists at the Naval Research Laboratory were sending out faint radio pulses, measuring echoes off aircraft, and realizing they could detect danger long before it appeared to the naked eye. By 1939, Britain's chain-home radar network stretched along the coast, a line of tall steel towers scanning the Channel skies. It looked primitive, yet it worked. In the coming Battle of Britain, that crude array would become the shield that saved a nation. Japan saw those towers too, through intelligence briefings and embassy reports. But within Tokyo's war ministry, most officers dismissed them as Western over-engineering. The Imperial Navy believed superior eyesight and instincts would suffice. Radar, they claimed, was a coward's tool, useful perhaps for merchant ships, but not for warriors. Japanese scientists, however, were not blind to its potential. A handful of engineers at the Naval Technical Research Institute, led by Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito, were quietly building their own version of the technology. In 1936, they produced a prototype called the Mark I Model 1 air warning device. It could detect aircraft up to 80 kilometers away. Yet the military refused to fund large-scale production. Too complicated, senior admirals argued. Unreliable in battle. Instead, Japan invested heavily in aircraft, torpedoes, and carriers, the tools of fast offensive warfare. They mastered the art of surprise attacks but neglected the science of detection. In those pre-war years, that decision didn't seem foolish. Japan's daring offensives, and China in the Pacific, met little resistance. But radar's quiet revolution was accelerating elsewhere. By 1940, the British had refined their systems to detect aircraft at night. The Americans, collaborating with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, began developing shorter wavelengths, microwave radar, offering sharper images and smaller antennas. Across the Atlantic, Germany fielded its Freya and Würzburg radars to defend the Reich. Meanwhile, Japanese industry lagged. The country's copper reserves were scarce, limiting the production of radar's critical magnetron components. And the imperial mindset, that mystical mix of arrogance and fatalism, saw science as secondary to valor. Within the Imperial Navy's pilot schools, this philosophy was doctrine. Recruits were told that Western machines dulled human skill. A good pilot, they said, feels his enemy before he sees him. Many believed it. They trained until instinct replaced thought, convinced that no mechanical device could outmatch their eyes or their honor. The irony was cruel. At that very moment, Western radars were learning to see through clouds, fog, and darkness, the very elements that once gave Japan's flyers their advantage. When war erupted in Europe, Japan watched closely, but their observers misunderstood what they saw. They focused on the bravery of Spitfire pilots, not on the invisible network guiding them to their targets. To them, radar was background noise in the symphony of war. And so, When Japan launched its lightning assault across the Pacific in late 1941, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Hong Kong to Malaya, their air fleets operated with near total confidence. They struck unseen, believing they alone controlled the skies. But on the edges of those battles, faint green blips were beginning to tell another story. Signals from early warning sets in the Philippines and Malaya hinted at something revolutionary. Machines could now detect men who believed they were invisible. That truth was coming, slowly, quietly, carried on radio waves no human eye could see. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan appeared unstoppable. The Imperial Navy's air wings carved a path of dominance across the Pacific. The Philippines fell, Singapore collapsed, the Dutch East Indies were overrun. Each victory seemed to confirm Japan's faith in human willpower over technology. Pilots who once laughed at radar now wore the smile of the invincible. But beneath that illusion, the tide of science was already turning. In the ruins of Pearl Harbor, American engineers salvaged what they could. Among the wreckage, they found not just twisted metal but conviction. Radar, though ignored that morning, had in its brief and forgotten moment detected the attackers nearly an hour before the first bombs fell. Commanders realized then what had been missed. The future of war would belong to those who could see first. By early 1942, the Allies began building new radar chains across the Pacific Islands, small, crude, and improvised, yet effective. Sets were mounted on palm-covered hills in Hawaii, on trucks in Australia, on coral outposts across the Solomons. Each one extended a hidden line of vision farther across the ocean. In Washington and London, scientists and strategists raced to adapt their systems for the vast Pacific distances. Long-range CXM radar sets were fitted onto American carriers and cruisers. Airborne radar was installed in B-17s and Catalina patrol planes, allowing them to hunt ships and submarines through cloud and night. At first, these systems were cumbersome, prone to overheating, jammed by humidity, and manned by men who barely understood them. But every week they improved. Each new frequency band, each refined antenna, stretched the Allies' invisible reach. Japan, meanwhile, still saw little urgency. In Tokyo, the Naval Technical Research Institute pleaded for funds to mass-produce the Type 21 air search radar. The response was polite but dismissive. Only a handful were ever built before 1943. Worse, Japanese commanders rarely trusted them in combat. That skepticism was cultural as much as strategic. The Japanese war ethos worshipped precision flying, formation discipline, and obedience. Machines that acted independently or interpreted data for officers were viewed with suspicion. Radar, with its flickering screens and cryptic echoes, seemed almost mystical, an unreliable ghost in a war that prized the tangible. By contrast, American and British crews learned to rely on radar like a sixth sense. During night patrols over the Coral Sea, destroyer captains began trusting the green dots more than their eyes. Pilots flying in darkness grew used to following calm voices from radar stations below, voices that guided them toward targets hidden by the horizon. The psychological shift was immense. The Allies were learning to fight through instruments, not instinct. Their warriors became part of a new ecosystem, men and machines fused into a single, coordinated organism. And soon that coordination would begin to crush the myth of Japanese invincibility. By mid-1942, radar was quietly reshaping Allied operations. At the Battle of Midway, American reconnaissance had already benefited from radar tracking of Japanese carrier movements. It was not decisive that day. Code-breaking and luck played larger roles. But it revealed something to American commanders. Radar was no longer an experiment. It was a weapon. The Japanese, however, still viewed it as a curiosity. Many airmen had never seen a radar screen. Some didn't even know what radio detection meant. When reports surfaced of American ships detecting planes before they were visible, pilots scoffed. They called it bakemono no maho, fool's magic. Yet in private, Japanese engineers were growing desperate. They knew their systems were years behind. They lacked the industrial base to catch up. Vacuum tubes were scarce, magnetrons rare, and coastal radar networks almost non-existent. The Empire's island stretched across thousands of miles, but its eyes were blind. In the laboratories of Tokyo and Yokosuka, scientists worked through blackouts and shortages to assemble prototypes. They listened to intercepted Allied transmissions, studying how their enemies used this strange power to command the skies. But the gap widened faster than they could build. By late 1942, the first Allied radar-guided night intercepts had begun. American fighters were now finding Japanese bombers in total darkness, tracking them long before any pilot saw a silhouette. The smirks that once filled Japanese cockpits were fading. Something unseen was watching them, and soon it would strike back. Radar's power was deceptively simple. It sent out invisible radio pulses that bounced off metal surfaces, aircraft, ships, or even rain clouds, and returned to the receiver. By measuring the time it took for the echo to return, operators could calculate both the range and direction of the target. To the untrained eye, the equipment looked unimpressive. Heavy boxes, spinning dishes, dimly lit cathode ray screens. But in those faint green echoes lay a revolution. For the first time in human history, man could sense the approach of danger beyond the limits of vision, day or night, in fog or storm. The Allies mastered it early because they had invested in it long before war began. Britain's chain-home network had proven radar's worth in 1940, and the Americans had expanded on that knowledge with mobile, naval, and airborne variants. By 1942, U.S. carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown carried radar that could detect Japanese aircraft at over 100 miles. Destroyers used short-range sets to track torpedoes and incoming raids. Japan, by contrast, was fighting blind. Its scientists were capable but underfunded. The Type 21 air search radar, Japan's first naval radar, could detect aircraft only within 70 miles, barely half the range of its American counterpart. Worse, its signals were erratic, often lost amid atmospheric noise or electrical interference. Operators struggled to read the fuzzy, inconsistent traces. But the real difference wasn't the machinery, it was the mindset. Allied commanders trusted radar. Japanese commanders doubted it. In battle, trust was everything. During early Pacific encounters, Japanese cruisers occasionally carried radar sets, but captains preferred traditional observation. Lookout crews scanning the horizon with binoculars. Many believed radar interfered with navigation or exposed ships to enemy detection, so while Allied destroyers maneuvered through the dark with radar-guided precision, Japanese vessels groped blindly through black waters, unaware they were already being tracked. Technology had quietly shifted the balance of perception. The Allies could now see in darkness. Japan could not. That invisible advantage would soon decide the fates of entire fleets. For Japanese pilots, the sky was a sacred domain. From the earliest days of naval aviation, they were taught that flight was an extension of spirit, that courage, discipline, and intuition mattered more than instruments. A pilot who relied too much on gauges or radio guidance was considered weak, detached from the warrior's soul. This philosophy bred remarkable flyers, fearless, instinctive, almost artistic in their precision. But it also blinded them to the new reality of war. When Allied reports began describing radar-directed interceptions, many Japanese aviators dismissed them as propaganda. They preferred to believe their losses were due to luck, weather, or treachery. Anything but an unseen machine. To admit radar's superiority would mean questioning the very essence of their military faith. A former Japanese airman later recalled, "We believed the enemy had eyes in the dark. It felt like magic, not science." That fear grew with every mission. Night after night, squadrons vanished without warning. No searchlights, no visible patrols. Yet somehow Allied fighters always seemed to know exactly where to strike. In the cramped ready rooms of Rabaul, frustration turned to superstition. Some pilots blamed fate, others American trickery. Few guessed that far beyond their sight, ground-based radar operators were calmly tracking their every move, relaying coordinates to waiting interceptors. Meanwhile, Allied crews developed a quiet confidence. Radar teams, often young, nervous men sitting in dim trailers or shipboard compartments, became the unseen heroes of the Pacific. They guided bombers through storms, vectored fighters toward incoming raids, and saved convoys from surprise attacks. Though seldom seen, their voices became lifelines. The psychological reversal was complete. Where once Japan's warriors had laughed at radio ghosts, they now faced an enemy who saw them long before contact. Pride had blinded them to the truth. In modern war, courage without information was suicide. By late 1942, the human cost of that arrogance was mounting. Entire Japanese bomber groups were being destroyed before they even reached their targets. Pilots returned from missions claiming they'd been ambushed out of nowhere. never realizing that the nowhere was radar. And within Japan's military command, whispers began to spread. Scientists pleaded for resources. Naval officers demanded radar coverage for major bases, but the old guard resisted. Honor, they said, was still the greatest weapon. That belief would soon meet a brutal reckoning, one written not in code or courage, but in the cold mathematics of detection and destruction. The machines Japan had ignored were now deciding who lived and who vanished from the sky. By early 1943, radar had become the silent director of Allied warfare. It did not roar like an engine or flash like a gun. It whispered, calculated, and guided. Every sweep of its green arc carried 1,000 silent decisions: when to launch, when to hide, when to strike. On the dark seas around New Guinea, that whisper became decisive. Allied warships equipped with the new SG radar sets could track Japanese vessels moving hundreds of miles away, even through heavy rain. The Japanese convoys, unaware they were being watched, sailed confidently under clouded skies. At the tactical level, radar reshaped how battles unfolded. American destroyers began fighting radar battles, night engagements where they opened fire without ever seeing the enemy with their eyes. Fire control radar directed gun turrets and torpedoes, turning the darkness into an Allied weapon. Japanese forces were stunned. Their naval doctrine was built on visual coordination, flag signals, light flashes, and shouted commands. In the black of night, their formations disintegrated. They couldn't see the enemy or even their own ships clearly. What had once been an advantage in their night fighting experience became a liability against radar-guided coordination. The same pattern emerged in the air. Radar-directed interception turned the sky into a chessboard. Allied ground stations could now vector fighters directly onto incoming bombers, minimizing wasted patrols and fuel. Japanese formations, relying on timing and instinct, found themselves ambushed with deadly precision. Even reconnaissance changed. Long-range radar allowed Allied commanders to plan operations with near real-time awareness. Convoys, patrols, and air raids were tracked hour by hour. Japan's invisible movements were now visible in glowing detail across Pacific command maps. The shift was subtle but absolute. The age of the heroic lone pilot was ending, replaced by a war of sensors, networks, and invisible lines of coordination. And for the Japanese command, this transformation struck at the very soul of their military ethos. Their pilots had once flown into battle with unshakable faith in the human spirit. Now they entered skies where machines, not men, decided who would survive the encounter. Inside Tokyo's war councils, radar sparked more than technical debates. It ignited philosophical war. On one side were the scientists, men like Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito and Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi, who had foreseen radar's potential years before the war. They argued that Japan's survival depended on catching up, building networks of coastal stations, fitting ships and planes with reliable sets, and training operators to read them. On the other side stood the traditionalists, admirals and generals who saw the war as a test of will, not machinery. Machines do not win battles, one officer reportedly said. Men do. To admit reliance on radar felt like surrendering to Western mechanization, betraying the purity of Japan's martial soul. This moral divide crippled Japan's ability to adapt. While Britain and the United States poured thousands of engineers into radar development, Japan's scientific teams were small, underfunded, and often relocated to remote facilities for secrecy. Many researchers complained that the Navy treated them as secondary to pilots and shipbuilders. The result was fragmentation. The Imperial Navy and the Imperial Army developed separate radar programs, refusing to share data or cooperate. Each branch sought glory independently, a microcosm of Japan's broader wartime dysfunction. The Americans, by contrast, centralized radar under coordinated command, integrating scientists, strategists, and combat officers in a single system. But beyond logistics, there was something deeper, a moral tension between old and new worlds. Japan's officers had been raised on the myths of divine spirit and invincible courage. Radar represented a cold, impersonal logic that measured death in pulses and frequencies. To embrace it meant accepting that courage alone no longer decided wars. Information did. As the war dragged on, even the most devoted believers began to falter. Reports from Rabaul, Truk, and the Solomons spoke of squadrons wiped out without ever spotting the enemy. The phrase, "they saw us before we saw them," became a grim refrain. Lieutenant Commander Ito, reflecting after the war, would write, Our radar research was advanced, but our thinking was not. We had eyes, but we refused to open them. That confession summed up Japan's moral defeat, not just the loss of territory, but the loss of adaptability. For in the end, radar was more than a weapon. It was a mirror, showing each nation what it truly valued: knowledge or tradition, reason or faith, humility or pride. And soon, that moral clash would erupt in one of the Pacific's most decisive engagements, a battle where radar turned the night itself into a trap. March 1943, the Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. A Japanese convoy of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers moved cautiously through rough waters, carrying more than 6,000 soldiers bound for Leh. Their mission: reinforce Japan's crumbling front in New Guinea. The Empire needed those men desperately, but the Allies were watching. Above the Black Pacific, hidden from view, a net of radar stations stretched across northern Australia and the Papuan coast. In secret huts and mobile trucks, Allied operators stared at glowing screens as faint pulses swept outward. Somewhere in the static they caught it, a cluster of returns moving northeast, slow, heavy, unmistakably naval. Within minutes, the convoy's position was fixed. The enemy had been seen before even one lookout could raise binoculars. The Americans had cracked the code of invisibility. For the first time in the Pacific, radar provided near real-time tracking of a Japanese fleet in open water. Allied aircraft were scrambled from Port Moresby, guided not by guesswork but by mathematical precision. The sky filled with movement, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs Beaufighters, all converging toward a point they couldn't yet see, but which radar knew was there. At dawn on March 3rd, the Japanese convoy spotted the first glimmers of silver on the horizon, aircraft glinting in the rising sun. For a moment, officers on the destroyer Horatio believed they'd been found by chance. They had no idea that their every move had been tracked for nearly 24 hours. Then the storm began. Wave after wave of Allied bombers descended, skimming just above the sea. Radar-guided coordination allowed squadrons to strike simultaneously from multiple directions, a tactic impossible without precise timing. The air roared with explosions. Ships tried to maneuver, but Allied pilots already knew their positions to within a mile. Within hours, chaos ruled the convoy. The transport Kyokusei Maru erupted in fire, its decks vanishing beneath boiling water. The Ayo Maru split in two under relentless attack. Japanese destroyers darted between sinking ships, rescuing survivors even as bombs fell around them. By the end of the day, the sea was burning. Out of 16 ships, only 4 destroyers escaped, all damaged. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned, trapped in the wreckage or lost to the current. It was a massacre without mercy, but also without visibility. Many Japanese survivors never saw the planes that killed them. They struck from the unseen, guided by voices from radar screens hundreds of miles away. To Allied crews, the Bismarck Sea was proof of concept. Radar could now direct mass air attacks with surgical precision. It was not just a defensive tool anymore. It had become the offensive brain of modern warfare. For Japan, it was an awakening wrapped in disaster. Survivors returned to Rabaul in silence. The report stunned the high command. Not only had the convoy been annihilated, but the enemy had known their course, timing, and approach. Someone had seen them long before they could see back. Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commanding the Southeast Area Fleet, was among the first to grasp the truth. He called for accelerated radar production and demanded every forward base be equipped with early warning systems. But it was already too late. Japan's industry could not match the Allied radar network that now spread like a web across the Pacific. The Bismarck Sea marked a turning point, a moment when the Empire's illusion of invisibility shattered. From that day forward, every Japanese convoy sailed in fear of an enemy that no longer needed to see to kill. The psychological shift was immense. Pilots spoke of ghost eyes in the sky. Commanders began changing routes at random, trying to confuse an unseen watcher they couldn't detect or jam. Yet every deviation, every trick failed. Radar had made chance obsolete. The Pacific had become transparent, and as the wreckage of the Bismarck Sea drifted across the waves, another truth began to surface. Radar wasn't just changing battles. It was changing the very meaning of war. Late 1943, Rabaul, New Britain, once the crown jewel of Japan's Pacific strongholds, Rabaul's harbors and airfields now lay under constant threat. Allied aircraft prowled day and night. Every takeoff, Every movement on its airstrips was watched, not by spies but by radar. From hidden outposts in the Solomon Islands and aboard patrolling aircraft carriers, Allied radar operators tracked Japanese planes the moment they lifted off. Within minutes, interceptors were airborne to meet them. For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. They had once ruled the Pacific skies through speed and precision. Now they were prey, hunted before they even saw the enemy. In Rabaul's command center, officers tried to make sense of it. Reports poured in. Squadrons ambushed in clouds, bombers intercepted in total darkness, ships attacked from beyond visibility. To many it felt supernatural. They could no longer tell where the enemy was, but somehow the enemy always knew where they were. Radar had become omnipresent, invisible yet inescapable. By this stage, the Allies had woven radar into every thread of their war machine. Airborne early warning aircraft circled overhead. Shipborne radar on cruisers and destroyers provided fleet coverage. Ground-based radar guided bomber formations through tropical storms with precision. It was an entire ecosystem of perception, a collective intelligence Japan could neither match nor disrupt. The results were devastating. In November 1943, Allied bombers began a relentless campaign against Rabaul's airfields and harbor. Using radar-guided navigation, American B-24s and Australian bow fighters struck through night and cloud, ignoring the weather that once shielded Japan's bases. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly, unable to pinpoint their attackers. Every day, radar extended Allied reach, turning fog, night, and distance into allies instead of obstacles. And every night, Japan's blindness deepened. Inside the Imperial Navy, panic turned to desperation. Engineers scrambled to deploy the Type 22 surface search radar and Type 13 air warning radar, designs adapted from limited German data on Freya and Würzburg systems. They were crude, fragile, and produced in painfully small numbers. Operators were poorly trained. Technical manuals were incomplete. In many cases, radars were installed but never used effectively. The Japanese Navy eventually fielded fewer than 200 functional radar units by 1944, while the Allies deployed thousands. The gap was not just numerical, it was conceptual. The Allies treated radar as an integrated command system. Japan treated it as a peripheral tool. The contrast became painfully clear in the battles that followed. During nighttime raids on Rabaul, Allied fighters coordinated in real time through radar control centers aboard carriers. Operators calmly vectored squadrons toward targets using precise headings and altitudes. Japanese defenders, relying on human lookouts and sound detectors, often scrambled too late, or not at all. A former Zero pilot would later recall, "We fought against ghosts. We flew into darkness, and before we knew it, tracers were all around us. We never saw who shot first." This growing helplessness began eroding Japan's air morale. The pilots who once sneered at radio magic now cursed it in fear. Some believed the Americans had invented a weapon that could see souls. Others simply lost faith in their leaders. Rabaul's radar failure mirrored a larger truth. Japan's wartime leadership had clung to ideology when adaptation was needed most. They had worshipped the sword while the world moved into the age of the signal. By late 1943, the base at Rabaul was effectively neutralized, not by invasion, but by information. Every convoy that tried to resupply it was detected before arrival. Every sortie that left its runways was tracked within minutes. Radar, code-breaking, and aerial dominance had fused into one unified vision of warfare. When General Douglas MacArthur declared, "Rabaul has been turned into a prison," it wasn't just rhetoric, it was literal. Radar had locked it in place. From that point on, Japan's strategic blindness was permanent. Every new battle, from the Marianas to the Philippines, repeated the same pattern: unseen detection, precise interception, and overwhelming loss. The smirk that once defined the Imperial pilot had vanished completely. Behind every takeoff lay dread, the certainty that somewhere far beyond sight someone was already watching. Radar had stripped away the romance of war. It reduced courage to a signal, valor to a pulse, and invisibility to a myth. The empire that once believed in the supremacy of spirit now faced a truth no creed could deny. In modern war, knowledge is power, and ignorance kills. By the dawn of 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, one defined not by who could strike harder, but by who could see first. For the Allies, radar was now as essential as fuel or ammunition. For Japan, it had become a symbol of regret. After the catastrophe at Rabaul, Japan's scientific community scrambled to close the gap. Laboratories in Tokyo, Yokosuka, and Kure were ordered to accelerate radar research by any means necessary. Engineers who had once been ignored were suddenly given authority, but not resources. Allied bombing raids had crippled Japan's industrial base. Copper vacuum tubes and precision components were almost impossible to obtain. Still, they tried. Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito, the quiet visionary who had first designed Japan's pre-war radar prototypes, was recalled from administrative duties to lead an emergency development program. He and his team studied fragments of captured Allied sets, along with German documents smuggled by submarine, incomplete blueprints for the Würzburg and Freya radars. From these fragments, Japan built the Type 22 and Type 13 radar systems, the Empire's last attempt to bring science to the front. The Type 22 could detect surface targets up to 35 kilometers away. The Type 13 aircraft at about 100 kilometers. By late 1944, a few dozen units were installed on destroyers, cruisers, and island bases. On paper, it seemed like progress. In reality, it was too little, too late. Japan's radar operators received minimal training. Many couldn't interpret returns correctly, confusing cloud echoes for aircraft or missing real contacts entirely. Power fluctuations, tropical humidity, and lack of spare parts caused frequent breakdowns. The Empire's fractured command structure meant radar data rarely reached pilots in time to make a difference. Meanwhile, the Allies had turned radar into a vast, coordinated network. From Australia to Saipan, radar stations communicated through encrypted radio channels, feeding a constant stream of data into Central Command. Air raids, naval movements, and submarine patrols were plotted with near-surgical precision. When Japan tried to deploy radar-guided night fighters in defense of the home islands, they found themselves hamstrung by inexperience. The Nakajima J1N1 Gecko Irving, Japan's first dedicated night fighter, carried a primitive airborne radar set, but operators struggled to synchronize readings with visual sighting. The system lacked power, and its signal often drowned in static. By contrast, American Hellcat and Corsair night fighters were guided to their targets by ground-based radar stations using the Ground-Controlled Intercept (GCI) system, the same doctrine perfected over Europe. Battles that once depended on eyesight now played out entirely on radar screens. Every Allied success widened the gulf. Every Japanese attempt to adapt felt like fighting shadows with candlelight. The Empire's radar infrastructure never reached critical mass. Only around 300 functional radar units were ever deployed across all Japanese services by 1945, compared to more than 10,000 Allied installations. The irony was bitter. Japan had once produced some of the finest engineers in Asia, men capable of building advanced aircraft, submarines, and torpedoes. Yet their warnings about radar had been ignored until it was too late. As one naval researcher later recalled, "When the admirals finally listened, we had no copper, no factories, and no time." By mid-1944, Japan's skies belonged to someone else. Allied bombers, guided by radar from distant stations, flew through storms and darkness without hesitation. Convoys moved with mathematical precision. The Pacific, vast, unpredictable, and once the Empire's shield, had become a transparent stage. The War of the Unseen was ending, and Japan was on the wrong side of it. By the summer of 1945, the empire that had once stretched across the Pacific was shrinking by the day. Cities burned under relentless bombing. The Imperial Navy, once proud and invincible, was now a scattered shadow beneath Allied skies that were no longer dark, no longer blind. Japan's defeat was not just written in ruined harbors or sunken ships. It was written in the invisible waves that had reshaped warfare, the electromagnetic pulses that reached further than any scout plane, faster than any codebreaker, and deadlier than any bullet. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Allied analysts entered Japan's remaining radar sites. They found a strange mix of brilliance and desperation. In underground bunkers, engineers had hand-built radar sets using scavenged radio parts. Some even used bamboo frames when metal ran out. Their oscillators were tuned by ear. Their receivers flickered with faint echoes of distant planes, proof that in spirit Japan's scientists had not given up. But their efforts had been isolated, uncoordinated, and unsupported. Each island outpost had fought its own battle against the dark. Allied engineers studying these remnants recognized a haunting irony. Japan had reached the edge of radar understanding, but never the scale to make it matter. The Type 13 radar, though primitive compared to British or American sets, showed remarkable ingenuity in signal filtering and antenna design. It was the work of gifted minds working in isolation, a scientific tragedy born from strategic blindness. Across the Pacific, however, radar had transformed from an experiment into a doctrine. During the Battle of Okinawa, entire fleets operated through radar-directed control. Fighter direction officers aboard U.S. carriers could vector interceptors to meet kamikazes long before they appeared visually. Ships that once relied on spotters now fought entirely through electronic sight. This shift was profound. It meant that information, not just firepower, had become the new currency of war. And in this invisible war, Japan had been outspent, outbuilt, and outthought. By the time Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed, the lesson was brutally clear. Technology that cannot be produced at scale is as powerless as having no technology at all. Radar had not only shaped tactics, it had redrawn the limits of what nations could achieve under pressure. For Japan, the psychological fallout was immense. Military officers who had once laughed at radar as Western trickery now viewed it as the unseen hand that had guided their destruction. Pilots returning from missions spoke of being hunted by ghosts, a phrase that captured the essence of what radar had become: omnipresent, intangible, unstoppable. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt from the ashes, many of its wartime scientists found new purpose. Yoji Ito, the radar pioneer once dismissed by his superiors, became a respected figure in post-war Japan's emerging electronics industry. His wartime frustrations turned into peacetime innovation, helping lay the groundwork for Japan's eventual technological renaissance. But the memory of radar's humiliation lingered in military circles. It was a reminder of arrogance, of how disbelief had blinded an empire. The Allies, meanwhile, took radar far beyond its wartime roots. The same technologies that tracked bombers over the Pacific would soon power civilian air traffic control, weather forecasting, and the early warning systems of the Cold War. What had begun as a military secret became one of humanity's most transformative tools. In that sense, radar had done more than win battles. It had ushered in the modern world. For those who had once mocked it, the irony was total. The smirk of disbelief that began in 1940 had faded into silence by 1945. The war had proved a simple truth. You cannot fight what you cannot see. But with radar, the unseen could see everything. And so, as Japan's soldiers laid down their arms, the hum of Allied radar still pulsed in the night air, invisible, relentless, watching. It had started as a whisper in the dark. Now it was the sound of victory. In the long shadow of the Pacific War, few inventions changed humanity's perception of battle as profoundly as radar. It turned the unseen into the known, the guessed into the measured. It erased distance, stripped away surprise, and in doing so, ended an era when courage alone could decide a fight. For Japan, the lesson was carved deep, not into stone or steel, but into memory. The empire's faith in tradition, in the eyes of pilots and the instincts of admirals, had collided with a new kind of warfare, one waged by scientists, engineers, and pulses of energy racing at the speed of light. Radar was more than a weapon. It was the beginning of a new philosophy of war. It taught nations that victory no longer belonged to the strongest arm or the bravest heart, but to those who could see first, think faster, and act before the enemy even knew they were found. The smirk of disbelief that once crossed the faces of Japanese pilots, that quiet confidence that no machine could replace the human eye, became the symbol of a world unready for its own inventions. Within 5 short years, that smirk had turned into silence. Radar had rewritten warfare, but it had also rewritten perception itself. It marked the birth of the invisible age, an age where information was weaponized, where light itself could be bent into strategy, and where the greatest victories were won before the first shot was fired. When historians look back at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they see more than ships and aircraft. They see a transition, the moment humanity stepped from the era of sight into the era of sensors. And in that transition, Amid the wreckage and radio waves, the world learned a truth that still echoes in every modern conflict. He who controls the unseen controls the future.